This is Shadowcast Radio.
Well. Welcome back, family and friends, for another episode of Shadowcast Radio with your host, Owen Brazington.
Preston Ackerman.
Nathan Brazington.
And we are going to a different arena. Last episode, we
can't say
found ourselves
anymore.
Found ourselves in the midst of Nazi Germany.
Mm.
And so this week I'm excited to see where Preston is going to take us with his.
Was that a Coliseum joke? We
What's
said
that?
we're in a different arena.
Oh,
I
that
didn't
was a subtle hint.
So we'll be talking about Rome. I mean,
like
we've
it.
already said in the past.
missed
so we're-
opportunity.
Okay. Yep.
So they know where we're going.
It's all good.
So today we're going to be talking about really the early beginnings of the Christian church, what happened immediately following the completion of the New Testament.
Yeah.
And so we'll be referencing the New Testament a lot to get a sense of what's happened historically and what followed after sort of the end of canon. So I think that's interesting. That's
I'm
always been an
excited.
area of church history I found fascinating.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, the early faith. So
Yeah,
that'll be a good
I
one.
feel like that's a very vague picture in many people's minds of what happened immediately preceding the writings of the New Testament.
Yeah.
Mm.
For me, it is.
well, it was just so long ago. And I think one of the things too is because it can seem so distant, so far away, it just seems as if it almost seems unimportant,
Right.
right? Not that it's not important. Of course, it's very important.
Right.
But because it's so far removed from us, it could just kind of be,
Yeah.
you know, unimportant to our thinking. But I think that's a mistake. And unfortunately, and this was the case for me, I didn't really love history growing up. Were you guys history buffs in high school? Did you like the
I
study?
history.
Did you?
Yeah. Our dad loves history, and I think we both got some of that. Probably all three of us boys did.
Mhm.
So I've always enjoyed history as well. Not necessarily the way it's like taught in school,
Oh, for sure.
but history itself, I definitely find.
See, I was not interested in it, and I don't know. I think I know why. I have some theories why, and I've had some helpful illustrations in my mind to help me gauge a new interest and appreciation for history.
Yeah.
Seeing it as stories,
Yeah.
because all of us love good stories.
That's right.
Yeah.
You know, even when I was a young kid,
good.
my mother would read stories to me. You know, where the red fern grows. Like we really take in informations and lessons from the stories we
For sure.
we read and we hear. So, well, history is just the story which God told. And keeping it in that perspective has really helped me find a great interest in history and studying it in adulthood.
I think the two are meant to work together well.
Mhm.
You know, good storytelling and then actual history, things that really happened. Because think about like really good movies when they're, you know, epic, and that's great in and of itself when it's good storytelling.
Yeah.
But when it says, you know, based on a true event or something that actually happened, that like gives it that extra
It really does.
kick that you're like, wow,
Yeah.
that hits a little harder than. So I think that's cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Short segue.
Okay.
What you got?
Historical event just really inspires you? You could say a movie based on a historical event that actually took place. Is there any particular story that really just is pretty incredible to you?
That's a good question.
I automatically know one, of course.
Okay. What you got?
The fight of the Scots against English monarchy.
Oh, okay.
So, of course, that Braveheart era would be
Right.
the incredible period where they were,
For sure.
a lot of men were fighting for their families, the preservation of their families and keeping their wives safe in a very much sense of that. And so it's cool to see their struggle.
Yeah.
Men who were in some sense, Braveheart, a man of small account, yet standing up, fighting for what is true and right.
Yeah.
And people gathering with him to be a force that had to be reckoned with.
Right.
I think for me, it might be the battle of the five armies. You guys remember that tale of history in Middle Earth? It's a good moment.
I knew someone was going to
was,
bring
uh,
it up. I'm like, who's going to bring up something that definitely did not happen? But they're like,
You don't know that.
that was
I
a
am
great
95% sure
Numenor.
that never happened.
Oh my goodness, that's awesome.
No, I really like so many moments. I think especially in church history, I guess that's what I've really tended to focus on is like what was God doing and what was the church doing, and that's kind of why we're doing this.
Yep.
These snapshot moments.
Yeah.
And there's so many characters that we've already covered that I just adore so much. Whitfield, Luther, Calvin, obviously.
Oh yeah.
In today's episode, there's not going to be really any specific characters or names that we're going to talk about, but it's going to be truly a snapshot. What was really the experience of Christianity in a broad way?
Yeah.
But obviously, those are made up of individuals. And something that I'm going to be really interested in Glory is talking with the saints of the past and hearing the untold stories, so to speak. Like what was their individual experiences in life that weren't written in the history books? I think that's going to be fascinating.
Oh, can you imagine the incredible stories if we got to even watch a video or
I've often wondered that, like, how will it? Yeah,
what incredible.
Maybe
stories.
we can view. Yeah, when we maybe someday in Glory we'll be able to just view that.
Yeah.
Like the past history as if it were happening right then and there. That would be crazy.
Because they would bring incredible glory to God. Where
Be
you're
cool.
like, wow.
Yeah, just to learn of
a point of
yeah.
really what seemed utter darkness, and here you see God
You
using
see God's
people,
providence and light,
bringing
in
out
it.
incredible victories.
Absolutely.
Can you imagine replaying the cross, like getting to see the death and resurrection as if it were happening right in front of you in real time? How crazy and powerful that would be.
Man.
Yeah.
So I don't know. We'll see. Maybe
That's
something like
interesting.
that'll happen.
Anytime anyone asks me what superpower I would want, I always make up the superpower of the ability to be able to look into the past and see. I might have mentioned that on the show before,
Maybe.
but I'd love to be able to just look in the past and watch it as if it's like
That
a
would be
television.
really cool.
Yeah. And just see what happens. I
And
could
see
just
how
kinda-
much was translated
Exactly.
incorrectly versus
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
that'd be
even hear
interesting.
some of the untold stories of some of our favorite church heroes. I think it'd be super interesting.
Then you could watch the Battle of the Five Armies happen.
Exactly, Owen.
Just like it did.
Just like it did.
I'm going to be bold enough to say I'm 98% that has never
Well,
happened.
But there's the 2%.
Here's what's
There
going to
is
happen.
the
though,
2%.
is we could
That's what I'm saying.
probably ask for it to be shown to us in the way that Tolkien himself imagined it.
Oh.
Okay, what if... Okay.
Say that's not impossible.
If you're in the Battle of the Five Armies, who are you in which army?
Which army?
And
well, if I'm in heaven,
we
hopefully
can't
I'm not
choose-
with the orcs.
We can't choose the same one. And who are you attacking?
Oh, that's a
No,
great
that is
one.
not the
Go.
question.
Preston's last.
Nonsense.
Dude, I'm gonna be I think it's on one of the it's on the extended version, but when I can't remember who all it's when the dwarves actually have the rams. And they
I
have the
love
charge
that
of the
scene.
bighorn sheep.
Yep.
It is epic.
Yeah.
That was fantastic.
I did
I'm
dwarves.
being one of those guys.
Yeah, I'm on Nathan's team.
Okay, what are you? Because we're coming straight for you. No, the other one that would be cool is the woodland elf king on the giant elk.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's
war
epic
elk.
too. That's pretty awesome.
What are
too.
they called?
The war elk.
The war elk. Actually, yeah. No,
I don't
agree.
know what else you call it. That's pretty accurate.
I just made that up,
But they are a war type elk.
Yeah.
I think someone in our church looked it up once.
Actually,
Andrew looked it up, didn't he? No, not Andrew.
historically,
it
there
is called
were
something.
some elk
Yeah.
that I think they were found in Ireland.
Mhm.
Some of the bones of
The great
massive
white elk.
Owen,
huge.
Owen, Andrew preached on Sunday
He
school.
preached on the white elk.
He did.
Oh,
No, he.
You're thinking of the white whale, and that's a different thing.
No, he
That's
did.
not in the
No.
He
Bible.
definitely
for the
did.
Lord.
It was on a Wednesday night youth group. He definitely did. He
Wow.
preached on this specific kind of elk. What was it called? He had a name for it.
I feel like you have to give some context because otherwise
Yeah.
people are like, "What are they teaching over there?" Like, this is ridiculous.
No, he definitely did. Okay, I'll follow up with him.
Yeah.
When
All
he's
right.
on the episode next, he's going to have to explain
Yeah,
himself.
find out what the tie-in to the gospel
No, there
was.
was.
I know there was
Call
one,
it.
but it just sounds so random.
No, it seems random,
Yeah.
but it was legit.
Huh. It's interesting.
It's very good.
Well, who does have the actual question?
That's a
of
good
the app?
question.
So I'm not going to make you guys.
Okay.
Well, you will have to answer the question, but I'm not going to throw a question on you guys. I pre-planned one.
Okay.
So
Cool.
this is the question that I have pre-planned for us.
I like it.
So if you could start, you guys have heard of podcasts before?
No.
You guys? Well, it's like a show that you listen to.
Sounds lame.
When you feel like it.
That's
So
a no
like
for me,
if you can
God.
imagine, you're out somewhere and you're listening to people talk, that's a podcast, but they're not there. So one of those. So if you could start a podcast, any podcast that you would want,
Okay.
what would you talk about on it?
Ooh. So something other than we're doing now, I'm assuming.
Oh yeah, you can't do.
You can't do
Okay.
what we're doing
I was gonna
now.
say.
You're starting
Whatever-
a new podcast.
Whatever that is.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a good question.
I got it.
What's it about?
I would get, it might be you guys. I don't know, but it would be a team of people that like were really good at playing off of each other and just
Oh yeah.
impromptu conversation. A lot. It would be heavy on the humor, and there would be like a spinny like bingo cage that holds the balls in it or
Yeah,
whatever. Each thing would be a different topic with like questions from random
Mhm.
people. So it could be anything from fashion to music to Bible to something happening in culture to furniture to whatever.
Yeah.
And whatever comes out, you just have to talk about it
Just
for
improv.
an hour and just
Oh,
a
dude.
lot of humor in it.
That would be kind of
And
fun.
maybe there'd be multiple questions, but really just ridiculous
Yes.
things and having a good time
Dude,
with it.
I think
would
that's a
be-
good idea.
And so
be
what would
really
you
fun.
call it?
Um,
That was in the question I wrote down too.
oh, what would I
Yeah,
call
what's
it?
its name?
I would call it
What's the name of your show?
randomized noise
Something
No.
noise. Yeah, no,
I
I
don't
kind of I get what you're saying.
because
Like,
it's just like it's just random. I would call it organized chaos. That's
Okay.
what I'd call it.
okay.
Organized chaos.
The organized
Okay.
chaos show.
I would have a very extensive research staff
Oh wow.
that would go out and talk to people from all countries and gather mysterious and odd stories.
Ooh,
Oh.
that would be cool.
Yeah.
I think, and
Yeah.
and they'd have to be substantiated in some way,
Right.
but
Right.
but they would go and share their mysterious and odd stories, and
Okay.
that where maybe perhaps people, the audience, would have to listen and say, "Okay, I think I understand the explanation for what happened."
Mhm.
Huh.
And other times they're like, "Well, that's just crazy."
Sure.
Mm.
So odd tales.
Yep.
What would you call it?
Odd Tales. TM.
A series of mysterious events.
Okay.
Okay. A series of mysterious events.
Okay.
Okay, I like that. It's
Sure.
a good one.
Good.
No, that's a good idea. I like the idea of going to seemingly uninteresting people, maybe not uninteresting in the fact that they're
Yeah.
uninteresting, but people that aren't pop famous,
Everyday
the
people.
everyday
Yeah.
person,
Yeah.
and just what's an interesting story that you have.
Yeah.
And just kind of interviewing, talking about an interesting story. It could be strange, it could be inspiring, whatever that might be.
That'd be cool.
But since that's too similar to yours, I'll come up with a different one. I think for me, I think it would be fun to dive into, I guess maybe a podcast on the arts, but that's in a very broad way applied. So that can mean music, that can mean visual arts,
Yeah.
it can mean even like breaking down of the art form of media in movies or shows, talking about the various themes of those shows or lessons, or
Okay.
even breaking down some of the, I don't know, the characteristics of a movie and why it was good, maybe why it was bad, or what lessons is it trying to teach us. So kind of there's critique of the art itself, but also to praise of it, and just really breaking down. An art critic, maybe that's what I'd call it, is an art critic. The art critic show.
Cool.
Yeah.
And just talking about anything from movies to shows to music.
That would
That'd
be
be
cool.
To painting. And I probably have Andrew on the show.
That'd
be awesome.
An interesting.
I think it'd be
podcast.
good.
Yeah. The art critic.
Do it.
I like it.
So, but I actually listened to a brand new podcast recently, actually. It's called The Hobby Show.
The
You guys
Hobby
heard of that?
Show.
Not the Hobbit
Show.
show. The Hobby Show.
That's
I have heard of the Hobby Show.
So shout out to Nolan Brasington, the third Brasington's two sons, Harlan and Jepson. Both of them started a podcast because they liked our podcast so much. They were inspired by it that they started their own little show.
That's awesome.
And they released an episode. And
I think they have 2 now.
do they have 2 now?
Yeah,
I think
they
they
have
have 2.
2 now.
Well, anyway, it's such a great. It's about 14 minutes long. It's a really cute show. They have a little question, and they have an outtakes part too.
Oh, that's
end.
good. A
Kind of
great,
something
great
that we
intro
do.
song as
So-
well, too. So,
Exactly. It's so good. So give it a listen if you're interested. I think the first show is about, it's about not pellet guns, but like BB
Like airsoft.
airsoft guns, and they break down the different kinds, how they differ from pellet BBs, and it's so fun.
It's fun. Good job, boys. Keep it up.
We're proud of
That's
you.
the Hobby Show. Look it up.
Now,
Yep.
listen, that's going to be on the link is going to be on our notes.
Yeah.
So be on the lookout for that and check it out.
Yeah.
It's
It's
going to
fun.
bring,
It's a
you
good time.
listen to this and you will walk away just smiling.
For sure.
It's so good.
and
They have a special guest.
Kids that did this with excellence.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I'm
and they have a
proud of
special
you.
guest. I'm not going to say who. You have to go and
Gotta
listen to
check
the
it out.
show
I
and
love
check
it.
it out.
Good.
Well done, boys.
Yep, well done, guys.
So, Preston, with that, it kind of leads us off to this
Mhm.
third ep in our series. And now we are planning, Lord willing, to
Mhm.
have a total of 4 episodes. And for the 4th and final episode on this church series, we're going to, our church history series, we'd love to have on our good friend and pastor, Will Cornell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
That'll
so,
be good.
but today he's not with us. Instead, you're leading the charge on this. And just looking over your notes, P, you did some excellent job on research.
For sure.
Mhm.
And I have to reemphasize that these brothers of mine have done some excellent research, and it's very time intensive. And so it's not something that's just thrown together the last of the moment. And we do that because we really see the importance of church history.
Mhm.
And we know that it can really speak volumes into our own Christian walks and happenings today. There's really application for that as well. And so as you start to study these, I often feel like we as the podcast hosts are some of the greatest beneficiaries of
Absolutely.
this, in that when we start to study, we realize God's amazing hand at work throughout church history.
Yeah, and it's so encouraging to hear of the faith and to relate to the saints of the past. That's something that's, it's an experience that I'm sure no person who doesn't know Christ can understand.
Yeah.
Like, how can I relate to people of the past so deeply? It's because we're family. Like, these brothers and sisters of the past, they're in the fam. They are brothers and sisters in Christ. And so when I hear about their stories and the experiences that they had and how I can relate to them to this day, it's like I'm knit to them, the saints of the past. And so it's just a powerful experience, I
it
think, to
is.
study church history in that respect.
You know what? And it really serves as a way of, I think it's so easy for us as Christians to become so focused on what we're going through right now.
Yeah.
And when we study church history, it really widens our perspective and zooms out to, we see that Christians before us have undergone the same types of sufferings and trials that we're going today.
Yep.
And that really brings us encouragement because we see God's faithfulness throughout their lives and realize that the same God that they served is the same God that we serve today.
Amen. And that there's nothing new that's under the sun as well. And the same tactics of the enemy that were used back then are very similar to that of today.
Right.
And so I think not that that's an encouraging thing, but it's a thing that is helpful to understand, and that the saints of the past who suffered for righteousness also endured, and we can too in our own day.
Yep.
So I find it encouraging in that respect. So as I've already sort of teased out for us, we're going to be talking about the time period of the beginnings of the church that we read about in the New Testament, the book of Acts especially, and then the time period that immediately followed that, just the things that happened, some of the persecution that occurred, and what the experience of Christians, what that was like about the time immediately following the completion of the New Testament. It's a period that I just find really interesting.
For sure.
And so Nick Needham, he poses a question in his 5-volume set in church history. It's called 2,000 Years in Christ's Power. I heavily relied upon his work. He poses the question, what was the... let me find it real quick. He poses the question, what was the world like when the Christian faith entered it? And so if you guys are familiar a little bit with the New Testament, you hear about Rome and sort of Rome's occupation of all things. And yet Rome didn't immediately just ransack Jerusalem and sort of wipe out the Jews. They were still a people that were independent. They had their own sort of culture, and they were able to live under the occupation of Rome.
Right.
And so if just to set a little bit of the perspective here, the space that really followed around the Mediterranean, that was the space which was occupied by Rome at this time. Rome essentially owned the world.
Yeah.
They were the dominant superpower of this day. And Rome was a very pagan society. Rome was not Christian. You might have heard about Roman Catholicism, that
Right.
language. But that wasn't necessarily the case at this time. Rome was not Christian at all during the time, of course, of the early church.
Right.
Rome was a pagan society. And so we want to talk a little bit about the different things that Rome did, what Rome was like when the Christian faith entered into it. And I just want to give credit due to Nick Needham for his work on the topic, because he really, I depended really heavily on his research in order to present that to you today. And so highly recommend that series. Owen has a really nice 5-volume set of Nick Needham's
I bought
2000
that
Years in
because
Christ's
you
Power.
recommended it, but man,
It's so
Have
solid.
you read it?
I have not.
Well, I didn't even realize that the fifth.
That's a lot to read.
Yes.
I've listened to it because I have it on Audible.
Oh, that's
Okay.
cool.
Mhm. But I'm not even listened to the last volume. I
I
didn't
was
even
going
know
to say,
that
how
came out
many
yet.
hours is that? That's a lot of hours, I'm assuming.
It's a lot of hours, but he's such a fantastic writer, and he tells it like stories, and he
That's
presents
awesome.
the history. So it's real
That's
easy
cool.
on long trips just to
Yep.
Yeah.
listen to it,
That's
I think.
cool.
So
You should put that in the notes too.
sure, like a link to it.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I will.
Sure.
That would
do
be
like
cool.
an Amazon link or whatever
Yep.
if anybody's interested in it.
Yeah.
No, it's really good. So painting the scene. So you have Judaism, of course, and that's really centralized amongst this people group that's on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. And every other spot, including Jerusalem, is occupied by this sort of pagan foreign nation to them, Rome.
Right.
Now, what was Rome like? Well, there are these different aspects of Rome that really encompassed its culture. I'm going to talk about 4 of those real quick.
Yeah, let me ask you a quick question though, real quick. I was interestingly asked this weekend, but how would you define pagan?
Mhm.
Just because we say that a lot, and
That's
I
a
feel
great
like
question.
we know what we're saying, but we don't often like explain that for someone that
Mhm.
might not be initiated with that.
Sure.
What does it mean to be a pagan nation?
So pagan meaning that you had a myriad of gods, and those gods were usually tied to specific things, whether that would be water or whether that would be like forests, love. And so we'll talk actually about specific examples of some of the pagan deities of Rome.
Right.
But they're gods that were worshipped, that were tied to some sort of specific location or aspect of life.
Right.
There was a god of agriculture, or maybe a god of the moon, god of the sun. There's even a king of gods, like a god who sort of had a higher tier position above the other deities.
Yeah.
So,
And you see this all over the world, different flavors of paganism.
oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's what we're talking about when we talk about Rome and Rome being a pagan nation.
Yeah. So that is one of the that is one of these characteristics. It was an important aspect
Perfect.
of life, Roman life, is that they were a pagan nation, and so they worshipped a family of gods. We actually know the names of many of these traditional gods because our planets, the planets in our solar system, are named after many of them. So you think of Mercury,
Yep.
Venus,
Yep.
Mars,
Pluto,
Saturn,
Neptune.
Jupiter.
Yeah.
Those are
all of
all
our planets.
So all of the
Mars.
planets,
Yeah.
pretty much, except for Earth.
Right.
But all of the planets that are, so really that sort of medieval cosmology, the medieval thinking,
Yeah.
Wow.
that exists in a lot of the semantic language of today.
For
well,
sure.
it shows you the popularity of it too, for
Mhm.
those
Oh yeah,
names to stick
yep,
Yeah.
like that.
absolutely. Even in the days of the week.
Mhm.
Right.
So there's Thursday is Thor's day, so on and so forth. So
Wow.
you really, it's ingrained, even though we don't even know it. Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
For
But
sure.
the thing is, even though we don't know of these gods, Rome certainly did. There was the myriad of gods, and it was the goal of the people of Rome to try to obtain the favor of these various deities. And
Right.
that makes sense. If you are going to entreat the favor of your god, then what you're going to do is entreat the favor of your god over specific areas of life,
Right.
obtain their blessing, because
Yep.
the gods have the power to influence the world.
Yep.
And so there was a god of marriage, a god of love, a god of war. And so you would entreat the god of war,
Yeah.
Mars, during times of
Fertility,
war. Yep, god of
agriculture.
fertility.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. So that was absolutely the case. This myriad of gods that existed during this time in
Right.
Roman society. Another aspect too was something that we call the imperial cult. And so it was a common practice to worship the emperor.
Yeah. Yep.
To worship him as a god. And so something that was interesting about that is so during this time you could see Rome in really kind of there were two sides to Rome. And we've talked about this in the past. You had one side that was traditionally Greek speaking.
Right.
And so that was the East, and then the West was Latin speaking. They had a lot of different cultural differences between the
Right.
two. On the East side, Greek culture was a really big deal. So they traditionally spoke Greek as their first language and had a lot of Greek customs. That's what we call Hellenism today.
Right.
And so in the Hellenistic side of Rome, those people tended to see the emperor as a god figure, as a god incarnate, literally, and thus were willing to worship him. While in the West, in sort of the Latin-speaking side of Rome, less people tended to see the emperor as a god incarnate, but they
Right.
did worship the divine favor that was accompanying the office, so to speak. And then
Yeah.
even after the emperor would have died, they would have then seen him as a god following them.
Okay.
Both sides would have.
Yeah.
And so something that was one of the important things that emperor worship did for that society is it demonstrated the loyalty of the people. And so if the people were willing to attend an altar ceremony and pinch the incense and say that Caesar is Lord, then it demonstrated that they were faithful to
Right.
the nation.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that was a very common practice as well during this time. The third one, which is interesting, it wasn't necessarily as popular, but I think it's worth mentioning. Another flavor of Roman society was these mystery cults.
Mm.
And So there were various mystery cults. And again, cults, it's kind of like one of those words again, too, that we sort of need to define. What is it called? Well, what's interesting is these mystery cults, they had different gods that would have accompanied them. Mithra, Isis. Well, what these gods were, they weren't traditionally tied to the pantheon, but they would have been brought into Roman society. And what marked these as different from emperor worship, or marked them as different from the Roman pantheon, was that these were volunteer societies that you would enter into. And what would accompany these events were some things that we do today. There were there were ceremonies, there were various gatherings, ritualistic events that would have happened too. Animal sacrifices, even feasting. I mean, but something that I think is interesting is how you entered into these various cults. So there was a way of initiation into them that you had to voluntarily enter into. And I want to talk about this real quick. And so the way you entered into one of these mystery cults is you would have to be bathed in blood. You had to go through a blood baptism. So what would happen is, if you wanted to enter into one of these cults, what you would do is you would enter into a pit, and then a wood grade would cover the pit, and they would slaughter a bull. And that bull's blood they would set on the crate, and it would, and then the blood would rain down on top of the initiate. And the initiate would open their mouths, they would drink the blood, and then they had to make sure that the blood covered every part of their body.
Wow.
And what that did is it promised them immortality, a form of eternal life that was offered specifically to them by way of initiation, a blood baptism.
It's crazy.
And so in the same way that we have consolation in the face of death as Christians, these mystery cult members had a similar thing. The traditional imperial cult or the pantheon of gods worshiping them didn't promise life after death, but these mystery cults did. Okay. And then sort of the fourth and last thing that really marked traditional Roman culture was philosophy. And we don't need to jump into some of the specific, well, I'll mention some of the specifics, but we don't need to necessarily jump into high detail. We kind of all know those people that are highly philosophical, who kind of think and contemplate life. Yep. That was really something that marked some of the citizens of Rome. Some of them would have been Platonist. There's a form of Middle Platonism that would have also included some of the thoughts from Aristotle. And this was a very religious philosophy that would have been somewhat
stemming
popular
from the Greek kind of culture.
Every single one of them did, actually.
Yeah.
That included Epicureanism, which was a non-religious philosophy, and then Stoicism, which focused heavily on the idea of materialism. And they even would have said that the soul was a very refined form of fire. And so all of these, like you just said, stemmed from Athens, stemmed from Greece. And another thing that's really important maybe to talk about here is that when Rome took over the world, and so when Rome came into when they came into and took over Greece and all the places that Greece had influenced, Greek culture had influenced, they didn't wipe it out, but they adopted it.
Right.
And that's what we call Hellenism, or the spreading of Greek culture.
Yep.
Okay.
And so they didn't eradicate it, but they adopted it.
Yep.
You know, what's funny is the elements of that line of philosophy that still survive today.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
I was actually thinking that. So he's been describing the backdrop, the setting of Rome when the early Christian church was getting rolling. But the funny thing is, I was thinking the exact same thing. I mean, traditional pagan religion, we have neo-paganism today.
Yep.
There's a big push to go back to some of that emperor worship. How many people are like, whether it's like it could be a religious leader or it could just be a political leader.
Yep.
How many people essentially worship a political leader, even if it's not, maybe they don't, worship in a traditional way, but it's like they've hitched their car 100% to this
Yep.
person.
This man
Absolutely.
is this person is the answer.
Right.
Yep.
And then you look at the mystery cults, that is totally like the new age
Oh yeah.
modern
Yeah.
occultism.
Oh, that's
And
crazy.
then philosophy, like that's, I think
yeah.
out of that, a lot of our materialism and atheism,
Absolutely.
a lot of that comes out of that. So really it's like, and I know we'll talk about this more, but our setting today is not that much different.
No.
It's disguised and it
Yeah.
looks different, but it's actually the same things,
Yeah.
just warmed up again,
Yeah.
which I find so
It's
interesting.
quote unquote more informed.
Right.
Yeah.
Now we're smarter, but we're doing the same things.
Same exact. Yep.
No, that's exactly
And expecting
right.
different results.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's insane. Yeah, there's a myriad of different kinds of cults that we see today.
Yep.
And maybe they might not be as bold and apparent maybe as some
Yeah.
of these, but they definitely follow cult-like tendencies.
Yeah.
So no,
Yeah.
you're
It's just
absolutely right.
repackaged, but it's essentially at its roots.
But
the same
New Ageism
things.
is a huge deal.
Oh, it
and
is,
the worship
for
of
sure.
Yep, Mother
Yeah.
Earth and those sorts of
Oh,
things.
it's
The use
going
of
crazy.
crystals and magic. It's
Yep.
definitely making a comeback.
It's
Materialism is not as popular in the United States.
no,
anymore.
it's on the decline, but yeah, occultism has totally taken up some of that space.
Mhm.
You look at witch talk and all the other stuff that is just blowing up right
Yep.
now. It's crazy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then, of course, during this time, though it wasn't an aspect of Roman culture, there, of course, was Jewish monotheism.
Right.
Because the Jews were not wiped out during Rome's taking over of the world. But they actually permitted the Jews to be able to practice their religion. Because, and this is something that I'll talk about a little bit later, they were marked as a religion that was allowed to be practiced.
Right.
And really, Rome was a society that was very syncretistic. They didn't really care too much about the gods that came in, so long as the religions themselves didn't disrupt Roman life or order. They didn't care what myriad of gods would have entered into
Right.
Roman society. They tended to allow them, permitted them space within.
Yep.
And so,
What's one more statue on the mantelpiece, right?
yeah. So if you
Throw
guys,
them in there.
yep. So if you guys remember, again, think about the time of the New Testament and also to what would have immediately followed. We see Paul going to Athens and to a place that's called Mars Hill. Again,
Right.
Mars Hill.
Right.
That god of war.
It's his hill.
He goes
Yep.
to the god of war's hill, and then he goes and he sees the myriad of statues at play,
Mm,
and he's talking with them in Acts chapter 17. You guys remember that story?
absolutely.
Paul at the Areopagus, and he sees a god there that's got no name
The unknown God.
to
Yep.
the unknown god. And we know Paul's response there. What you
Declare
proclaim is
to make it
unknown.
known.
Yeah.
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 And then he introduces, of course, who the true God is. So
Yeah. That's
like
awesome.
this is the world that the church entered into,
Yeah.
was that sort of worldview in society.
Yeah, and we see that in scripture for sure, which I know you're going to talk about, but
Yeah.
super clear. So I think that's a really good backdrop actually for us to have in mind as
Yep.
we look at how did the early church do in this setting?
And so what happened now as a result of the gospel, which is the good news of Jesus, the
Mhm.
King, the eternal God who condescended and put incarnated, he put flesh, carne, on himself, and he lived the righteous, perfect life as the new Adam. He
Right.
offered up his own life on the cross on behalf of his people. He died, and then he was resurrected. And in that act of God, peace between man and God can
Mm.
happen
Mhm.
through faith in
Amen.
what he did in that work. And this is what's so wild is that story, because it actually happened and was validated by eyewitness testimony, it began to spread
Mm,
because people witnessed the resurrected
Right.
Lord.
Yep.
And so the Jesus movement happened. The resurrection, it was the mighty vindication from God that all of Jesus's teachings and claims were true and that he really
Right.
was the Messiah. And now all of church history flows out of that central reality. This is
Right.
what the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, related directly to the gospel and the resurrection. He says in verses 3 through 11, quote, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep.
Mhm.
Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is in me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preached, and so you believed.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
And so this message, which transformed the hearts and lives of men, was from a result of the resurrection.
Right.
Jesus resurrected bodily, physically. He was seen and witnessed by people.
Right.
And if I can throw in concerning apologetics,
Yep.
this passage is an incredible resource
Yeah,
for apologetics.
for sure.
Because if you realize the context that he was writing it in,
Yep.
he's saying, test me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've given witness, and many of these
They're
witnesses
still alive.
are still
You
alive.
can validate it.
So
Yep.
go validate it.
Yep.
You
Yeah.
don't believe me. And so
For sure.
I think that's people can jump over that and fail to realize what a great apologetic resource this is for the resurrection.
That's a good point.
Yep, absolutely. And so we read in John chapter 1, which is the beginning of John's account of the good news of Jesus. It says it has the specific detail in there that Jesus came to his own people. And so that would have been traditionally, of course, the Jews,
Mhm.
but they received him not. But to all who did receive him and who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, right? And so by and large, the people of Israel didn't recognize their own Messiah had come,
Right.
right? But some did. The very first believers in Jesus were Jews. And so the Jews that were in Jerusalem, who would have witnessed then the resurrection of Jesus and would have believed in this work, the first Christians were Jews. Not all, of course,
Right.
but mostly.
Right.
And they were Jews in two sort of separate camps. There were those that were the Hellenistic Jews, and then there were those who were more traditional Jews. And so, as we sort of already discussed, Hellenism means the study of Greek culture or the
Right.
spread of Greek
Influenced
culture and
by Greek
influence.
culture. Yeah.
And so there were people who would have been ethnically Jew from a genes standpoint, but they probably, a lot of Hellenistic Jews who didn't live in Jerusalem would have grown up around Greek culture, so they would have adopted sort of the Greek mind, Greek thinking, but were ethnically Jewish.
Right.
And so those Hellenistic Jews had a lot of different opinions than the traditional Jews would have, and there
Right.
was, you see them bickering over things in the New Testament. But both classes, not fully, of course, but both Hellenistic Jews and traditional Jews believed in Jesus.
Right.
And there was a incident that we read about in the book of Acts of the very first martyr. His name was Stephen. You guys remember that story in the book of Acts?
Mhm.
I've never heard of that.
You never heard of him?
No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, no, great.
Well,
story.
he was one of these Hellenistic Jews. And so what occurred, and this is just a point for us to keep in mind. Okay. So the first persecution that we see was against the Hellenistic Jews, for example, like Stephen. And in Jerusalem, as persecution is arising from traditional Jews against Hellenistic Jews
Mhm.
who believe in Jesus, the gospel spread and went outside of Jerusalem. And so
Because as they are persecuted, they leave.
Yep.
Take the gospel with
they take
them.
the gospel.
It spreads.
Yep, and it spreads. And so there are still Christians, of course, in Jerusalem during this
Right.
time, but they were traditionally minded Jews. And so these Jews still would have went to the temple. They were good.
Yep.
They were, yeah.
Like James
Adherences to.
would be a very, not the Hellenistic Jew. but
Yep. So there was the
yeah.
non-Hellenistic
Jewish.
Jews,
Yep.
those who really held to the traditions
Mhm.
that you see lined out in the
Yep.
Old Testament. And then the Hellenistic Jews, which were persecuted, and then they spread.
Right.
And so a lot of those Hellenistic Jews, they traveled to the north to a place called Antioch. And we read about Antioch, the church in Antioch, in Acts chapter 11. I want to read this real quick because it kind of gives a sense that the gospel went forward out from this persecution, and you heard Gentiles hearing the gospel for the first time.
Yeah.
And so, by and large, in this city in Antioch. So, this is Acts chapter 11, verses 19 through 26. Now, those who were scattered because of the persecution, that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, speaking the word to no one except Jews. But there were some of them, men of Cyprus and Cyrene, who on coming to Antioch spoke to the Hellenists also, preaching the Lord Jesus. And the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number who believed turned to the Lord. The report of this came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch. When he came and saw the grace of God, he was glad, and he exhorted them all to remain faithful to the Lord with steadfast purpose. For he was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and of faith, and a great many people were added to the Lord. So Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul. And when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. For a whole year they met with the church and taught a great many people. And in Antioch the disciples were first called Christians.
Yeah.
And so this church in Antioch was not located in an area that was Jewish, but was actually heavily Greek and occupied by Rome. It was full of Gentiles. And yet the gospel thrived there on account of God's sort of sovereign providence.
Yep.
And from there, a lot of the Hellenists believed in the gospel. And so the gospel goes out from this period of time of persecution, but also the gospel went out too from the hand of the apostles as well. For example, we think of course, the apostle Paul. I want to talk about a specific interesting fact in history that I just find so fascinating, and I want to share it here.
Sure.
So in AD 66 to AD 73, Rome utterly crushed Jerusalem. This is what we call the Jewish War. They occupied the city. They destroyed the temple in AD 70, and they killed a ton of the Jews. I think it was estimated by Josephus that there might have been 1.1 million lives lost.
Wow.
In that war.
That's crazy.
In that ransacking of Jerusalem.
That's a lot.
So, and thousands of others who would have been sold into slavery.
Right.
It was an utter destruction of the Jewish people, an onslaught. But what was really interesting is that none of the Christians, the traditional Jewish Christians, took part in the war. They were warned by Jesus to flee the city. And we actually read about that in Luke 21, verses 20 through 24. I'm going to read that real quick. It's super interesting. So Jesus says this, quote, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let none of those who are out of the country enter it. For these are days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. Alas, for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. For there will be great distress upon the earth, and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword, and be led captive among all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled."
Yeah.
And so what's so fascinating is that the Christians in Rome, or the Christians in Jerusalem, heeded the words of Jesus, and they fled to the north. There's actually recorded evidence of the early Christians leaving Jerusalem before the serious fight started, and they took refuge in a city in Pella, which is east of Jerusalem, or east of the Jordan River, north of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And so they
still located in Israel.
No, well, at the time it actually would have been outside of Israel.
It would have been okay. Refugees to another country, essentially.
Yep, it was a Greek town,
okay.
Pella.
Huh.
And so they actually heeded the words of Jesus, and there's historical records of them not being.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Does it give
their lives
anything
being
like
preserved.
Numbers?
How many numbers?
Yeah, like did they give like a ballpark?
I don't know how many Christians there were at that time in Jerusalem, but virtually very few, if none, of the Christians died in that war.
Wow.
So awesome. I don't know how many Christians there were at that time. Maybe Eusebius writes about that, but I don't know the answer off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting. But this kind of plays into a specific aspect of Roman life and culture that occurred really to anybody that would have come against Rome.
Yeah.
It was that Rome and their government, they were not afraid to kill people.
Right. For sure.
Persecution was a big deal. The Jews, Christians, there was persecution all around during this time. There are a few examples of people, of emperors who would have persecuted Christians in the early parts of the Jesus movement. In the year AD 64, the Roman Emperor Nero, he was really the cream of the crop when it came to sinister and a man who had a ton of bloodlust.
Yeah.
So there was an event that occurred in AD 64. Some people actually think that it was Nero's fault,
Right.
but there was a fire that occurred in Rome, and it destroyed, what was it, like 10 out of the 14 districts?
Wow.
It
I
was
didn't
a
know
lot.
it was that widespread.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they call it the
biggest
Great Fire, but
I think it was the biggest fire in Roman history. So
Yeah, many think that because Nero wanted to do a project there, and basically they didn't want him to, and so it was like, oh, and then the same area happened to catch fire and burn down.
Exactly.
just
now
a
we can-
coincidence.
Now
That's
we
it.
can do this project.
Well, people were obviously suspect of that. So
Right.
what did Nero do is he blamed it on the
Exactly.
Christians.
Mm.
And so he did a lot of very sinister things to those who were believers in Christ. He would have... so the Roman historian Tacitus records these events. These Christians would have been arrested by the authorities. Many people, they would have been mocked. They would have been forced to death, torn by beasts. So you think of like the Roman Colosseum.
Yeah.
Christians would have been torn to beasts in game. And then also too, Nero famously would light up his gardens with candles made by these Christians. And so he would burn the Christians and they would light up his gardens.
Man, can you imagine just the visual contradiction of that sight?
It's insane.
Here you have a beautiful gardens
Mhm.
being lit up by,
The bodies of the saints.
yes.
But I find something beautifully ironic about that too, when you think about it, because think of the words of Jesus. You are the light of the world, a city that's set on a hill. And think about too, Jesus refers to, in Revelation chapter 1, he refers to the church as lampstands, those who are lights, right? Who shine the light. And so though that was a very sinister event, what I forget who said it, but the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And from this persecution, the Christian faith spread. And so a light was there nonetheless, so I find something almost ironic. It's twisted and it's evil, of course, but there's something kind of beautiful about how that story God redeems.
It had an adverse effect that Nero,
Did not
emperor
expect.
of the superpower of the world, was unable to control.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
he did start a fire, all right.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
real. Like,
and the
that
fire
is
has
true.
gone on.
through that, the gospel spread
Wow.
like fire.
Yeah.
So,
Yep, amen. So during this time, there was not an emperor, or there was not an empire-wide call to persecute Christians. It was more either city to city or district to district. It was really up
it
to
was
the fancies
regional.
of. It was regional. It kind of just depended upon what each governor wanted to do, so to speak. The Emperor Domitian, AD 81 to AD 96, he also persecuted Christians. He saw the group as a threat to traditional pagan religion and order in Roman society. So Christians were subjected to imprisonment, exile, and even death.
Yeah.
I actually think there's an argument to be made, possibly, that it was Domitian's, from Emperor Domitian's exile edicts. That's what led to John's exile at Patmos.
Yeah,
So
it could be.
It's possible that could be a tie directly there.
Interesting.
But we can't know that for certain. But
So so there was varying views of emperors regarding the Christians, but how did the cultures, your everyday Roman citizen view Christians? Well, I guess what was their perspective?
well, this is what's really interesting. So if a emperor or maybe a governor saw the tradition or saw Christians as interfering with Roman society, producing chaos, whatever that might be, then they had really the authority to begin persecuting Christians. But some emperors, they would go with the public opinion. So if it was, the opinion of people within their jurisdiction who didn't like Christians, if the people wanted to persecute Christians, then the
emperor
governors
go with it.
Yeah.
the governors.
The governors, the various governors
Saw it as an opportunity.
as an opportunity
to
please the people.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we will talk a little bit about the view of Christians at large from the average pagan. And so because Rome, we need to answer a quick, we need to return to, again, a specific point in Rome's psyche. They were a very syncretistic people. And so they believed in a myriad of gods. Religion was very much everywhere. There were lots of gods over various districts. And Christians were seen as strange because they didn't believe in those gods, but they believed that there was only one God. And so what's really interesting is that we talked a little bit about all these various gods that were in the that were in Roman worship, Mars, Jupiter. But what's interesting is those were gods that were actually originally in Greek culture. And so each one of those gods has a Greek equivalent.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So, for example, Jupiter is the Roman name for the god of the Greek god Zeus. So Zeus and Jupiter are the same. Or Poseidon and Neptune are the same. Poseidon is the Greek name for Neptune. And so in a syncretistic society, they just adopted the gods of the territories that they overcame and just added them to their own sort of pantheon of gods. You actually see an example of this occurring also too in the New Testament. You guys remember that story in the book of Acts where there's a riot that occurs in Ephesus? That's over the goddess Diana in Ephesus. I want to read that account real quick because it kind of goes to show you some of the ways that Christians interfered with the traditional expectations of Roman society. Let me read that real quick, and then we'll discuss some of the details, the various cultural differences between Christians and Rome at large. So this is in Acts chapter 19, verses 23 through 27. Let's read that real quick. About that time, there arose no little disturbance concerning the way, for a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen in similar trades and said, Men, you know that from this business we have our wealth, and you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be disposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship. And so what's happening in that story is there's, like there is with all trade and tourism,
right?
When you have a lot of foot traffic at a place, there's lots of opportunity to make money. Well, what's the sight to see? It's the temple of the goddess Diana. And it was one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. So people traveled from all over the world to worship Diana in her magnificent temple. And so this Paul, who's arrived and he shared the gospel, he has persuaded a great many people that God is not made by human hands, that God is no idol, but that he is the creator of all things. And you can't produce an image of him, right? And so because of the works, or because of the gospel that is being proclaimed by Paul, that means there's less demand for these little silver Diana statues. And so it was running into conflict with the commerce of the day. Right. And so what occurs as a result of this is that they almost begin to start a riot. They run off into the amphitheater, and there's all this chaos that's happening because of the Christian worldview, which is infiltrated. It's interfering with the sort of the society of Ephesus at the time. And so something that's really important about this detail here, Christianity cannot be syncretized. It cannot fit into and be morphed to fit into a culture. It is the thing which influences. And you cannot bend Christianity to fit an existing culture, to fit its worldview and system. It is the Christian faith which is true, and it will run into conflict with
Absolutely.
anything which is untrue.
That's
Yep.
good.
And so that was absolutely the case when it came to the ways that Christians lived in their daily lives. Christians, their lives were transformed and changed. They wouldn't believe in the myriad of gods. They didn't believe in the traditional aspects of Roman society.
Yeah.
And it made them outcasts. It made them weirdos. It made them strange to their
Yeah.
neighbors. And it did that in a myriad of ways. So Christians, because pagan religion was involved in virtually all aspects of Roman culture,
Mhm.
it meant that Christians would run into paganism in virtually every aspect of society.
Yeah.
So there was pagan religion, which was practiced in the state, like official state holidays would involve the worship of the gods. In public entertainment contexts like theater, there was often pagan sacrifices.
Yeah.
Even the shows themselves would portray pagan religion and sometimes even sexual immorality, depending. Christians would reject all forms of entertainment because of the involvement of the pagan deities.
Right.
But also, too, they would reject other forms of pagan of Roman entertainment just because of its gross immorality, like the
Right.
gladiatorial games,
Right.
right? Just because God came to give life, not to take it. And so watching the entertainment of men and women being marred by beasts, though that was entertaining in Roman society, to the Christian, that was awful because
Right.
that's the image of God being marred. And so you see Christianity in conflict with the culture that it lives in.
Mhm.
And that was in virtually all aspects of society too, even school. Because in school, you learned about the pagan gods,
Right.
and you learned about their stories and how, they were the ones who started Rome and these various stories that are recorded in the Iliad or the Odyssey. And so
But
Christians
they had
couldn't be,
neutral. They had neutral education.
but they were totally neutral.
worldviews.
But they were
Yeah.
perfectly neutral,
Right.
right? This I thought was interesting, was that even hospitals would bring reprieve on Christians because hospitals would employ priests of the specific god of healing, Alcepus, the god of medicine and healing. And so there was even a conflict there when it came to health.
Yeah.
So pagan religion was taught in schools. Even Christian artists could hardly be employed because they would be asked to write scenes or symbols related to the
Right.
pagan gods.
Right.
And so politics, army, teaching, it all in some way reflected this pagan view
Mhm.
of the world,
Yeah.
meaning that the gods were the ones that were in control, all these various gods. And Christians ran into conflict in almost all aspects of it.
Yeah.
And so because Christians rejected the widespread practice of all of these things, whether it was sexual ethics or whether it was, there was actually a form of abortion even back then as well, or infanticide,
Right.
Christians saw the value of the image of God even from a young age back then. And because that was just completely normal in pagan society, Christians ran into conflict there.
Right.
There was even this edict or this idea that was common in Roman society of easy divorce
Mm.
as well. So as you're beginning to kind of see, there's so many ties to our own day and age.
Right.
We'll get to those. But as you can see, Roman society was almost entirely antithetical to the Christian faith and the Christian worldview of this
Mhm.
time. And so because of that, the exclusive truth claims of Christianity, namely that there is one God and there's only salvation in Christ alone, this really brought sharp disagreements between Christians, of course, and the citizens of Rome.
Mm.
So Christians were seen as weirdos. They were seen as strange. They would have been called atheists at the time.
Which is funny.
So
That's
away
a
with
bit-
away
yeah.
with the atheists became a common Christian
That's crazy.
saying, away with the atheists. Another one that I thought was really interesting is that Christians, because they wouldn't worship the gods, anytime there was a local calamity or catastrophe, locals would blame the Christians for it because they thought that the gods were upset because Christians were converting pagans. And so there was this saying that is recorded by Tertullian. He says, quote, this was a common saying, when the Tiber floods or the Nile fails to flood, up goes the cry, Christians to the lion.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Or it became a popular saying also back in that day, no rain because of the Christians. And so Christians back then had a burning, had in them a burning desire to convert pagans.
Mm.
They cared deeply about missions and the spreading of the gospel. And that was becoming such a problem in society that people now began to blame the Christians because their neighbors would be either converted. There was local calamities because, of course, there were gods over rain, gods over the sea, gods over crops.
No one's worshiping them, or less people.
Or less people are worshiping them.
Bringing all these disasters.
So there was mass, a strong mass hatred of Christians in pagan Rome.
Yep.
Whether that came from the emperor himself, the governors, but also even the people as well. So this is the takeaway that I want us to talk about. So Christianity, with its exclusive truth claims that there is only one God,
right?
That there's no myriad of gods, and that those gods are really false gods or they're demons,
right?
That message of the gospel is not itself going to change when it comes into conflict with other worldviews. It will influence it, right? In such a way that there is now conflict between the two.
Right.
And how many parallels do we see like this in our own day and age? And so the way that you saw pagan religion involved in all aspects of society, there's really a new form of that today.
Oh, for sure.
Like the religion of wokeism.
Yep.
Like you see the call to allegiance to the ideas of woke ideology that is involved in virtually all aspects of society now. Entertainment, right? You see it in entertainment, in schools.
Yep.
You see it everywhere.
In business.
In business.
You know,
if you don't bend,
it affects everything.
If you don't bend the knee, you will be considered an outcast in these, in regards to these areas.
And this makes me think, like, I think that a lot of times, a lot of Christians has been deceived into the idea that light and darkness can coexist with each other. And by nature of the message of the gospel, when we really ponder it and think about it, you realize that nope, light will overcome darkness. And that's why there's going to be huge animosity for when Christians are behaving as Christians should. There's going to be major pushback and persecution because light is overcoming or exposing darkness for what it is.
That's right.
And you can't have simple coexistence between what is righteous and true and just and that which is evil.
Yeah. Think about the temptation on the part of Christians back then, because their pagan neighbors would have come to them and said, it has not rained. We are in a drought. And it's because of what you're doing. You need to start worshiping the gods. Think about how much death is going to occur because of what you are doing. Like, can you imagine the temptations that would have occurred of compromise, like to compromise the gospel on the part of Christians and to just, just adopt Roman society and its norms?
Yeah.
The temptation was there. And that is so similar to our own day and age. How easy is it to adopt progressive theology so that it can kind of adapt to the current aspects of culture?
You're spreading Christians are spreading hate and intolerance because you don't embrace this wickedness that is happening.
I mean, you look at anything from like biblical sexuality and gender, marriage, abortion, all of those things that the Bible is clear on. And now it is considered hateful to hold those same positions that, to hold the biblical definitions the way God has designed things, to hold those as truth and stand by it is now, we don't live we started in a nation that was founded on some biblical principles.
Mhm.
And so I think just now believers in the US are coming into a place where it is pretty Roman-like,
Mhm.
the culture in saying that you're the problem if you hold to those things. And
Yep.
we've been in an age where I feel like we've given up a lot of ground. The church has
Mhm.
really said, well, we'll try to have some syncreticity of our own, right? We'll
Mhm.
try to kind of make it work. And,
Yeah.
and I think in a way it's discouraging, but in a way it's exciting to see that we're coming to the point where I think the
Mhm.
church, God is refining his bride, and we're saying,
Amen.
hey, we can't be half light, half dark. We have to stand
Yeah.
for truth and let the power of the gospel do its work.
Mhm.
And it's exciting to think what that could lead to.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
That's
it's
good.
also possible that it could, revert back to a kind of persecution that we saw back
Oh,
then
for
as
sure.
well.
I think
Christians
it will.
off to the lion. Like, are we going to be bold enough, like the Christians back then,
Yeah.
to offer up our own lives
There
if
are
need
forms of that already where we've seen persecution of businesses that
Oh,
will
yeah.
not
Sure.
toe the line, and
be? Absolutely.
in terms of,
Oh, yeah.
not their acceptance of the world's view of marriage
Mhm.
is already examples that we see.
Oh, yeah.
But I foresee that being a lot more widespread.
Yeah, it's
Sure.
very possible.
Sure.
But it's just crazy to see so many of those parallels, even infanticide, the view of the young,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Like, even the widespread, like, gross sexual misconduct of the
Mhm.
time of Rome. You see a very similar thing happening in the United States
Absolutely.
with the sexual revolution, with easy divorce, those sorts of things.
Yep.
Yep.
Even pedophilia.
Yeah.
Like, you start to see a lot of that being uncovered in Hollywood.
Yep.
And that was just kind of normal behavior back in the time of Rome. If you were if you were a man who had high status, then you really had free license to abuse slaves or
Yep.
people that were of lower status. And it was just completely common and normal.
Yep.
Like, Harvey Weinstein would have been pretty much on par with what we would have seen back in ancient Roman society.
Yeah.
Yep.
And Christians stood against it
Yeah.
because there is a sexual ethic that God has prescribed
Yeah.
for his people to
Mhm.
honor and follow. And so in almost every aspect of life, you saw conflict when it came to the faith of the Christians against its society. And man, we are so close to pretty much that same thing in today's era.
Mhm.
That's what I find fascinating about studying church history.
Yeah.
But that can seem real bleak and difficult to understand. But something that you have said in the past, Nathan, has been helpful for me. It's to remember that we have an eternal perspective
Mhm.
and that this world isn't our home, but we belong to another world. We ought to be thinking of that world.
Mhm.
Like, if we hold fast to our lives now, we will lose them. But for those who are willing to lose their life for the sake of the gospel, they will actually gain life,
Right.
according
Exactly.
to the scriptures. So being able to live within that tension of recognizing that we are people that are strange and we are people that are odd in our society and in our culture, really to the world. But nonetheless, we need to stay steadfast, grounded in God's truth, no matter what the
Mhm.
culture says,
Yep.
because
good.
it is his world and he will ultimately restore it in his timing. So,
Yeah. And we see him over and over use that for his glory.
Yeah.
Out of those trials and those hard things, he uses people to stand firm for him by his grace. And out of that brings beauty from ashes over and over
Mhm.
again. So,
What's really interesting as just a teaser, and maybe we could talk about it in the future, but that wasn't always the case. Eventually, when you get to the early parts of the 4th century, there's this really famous emperor who gained access to the throne, and his name was Constantine. And Eusebius, the church historian, talks about the time of the battle of the the Milvian Bridge,
mhm.
and I think it was around 314. He says that was around the time that Constantine would have been converted to the Christian faith, and Constantine, the emperor of Rome, made Christianity very popular at that day. He kind of destigmatized it to Roman society, and then it would later become the official religion of Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And so Eusebius saw that as God's vindication and victory over pagan Rome, of course, in that time frame. And so God was sovereign even over that, right? He told the story of the persecution that eventually led to victory over it, specifically in that story. But we know for all of us, Psalm 110:1, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make all your enemies a footstool for your feet.
Mm-hmm.
And so every enemy, every nation that is wicked will be destroyed if it's an enemy of God, of God's, and he will be victorious over it. And so even if that's not in our lifetimes,
Right.
that's okay.
Yeah.
Because we can trust the God of history
Absolutely.
to oversee it in his
Absolutely.
timing. But
You know, and one thing I can appreciate for time periods like this, like obviously every age of the church will have battles to fight
Mhm.
and trials to fight. But with an age like this, especially for those Christians living during Emperor Nero's time,
Yeah.
the battle lines were clearly drawn.
Yeah.
And I see some of the challenges of when you have a cultural acceptance of Christianity.
Mhm.
It's sad because those lines are very blurry
Mm-hmm.
and you deal with the enemy of apathy.
Yeah.
And I think of one of the hardest verses in the Bible where many will say to the Lord, 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 did I not do X, Y,
Right.
Z,
Yep.
all these?
Yep.
And he'll say,
Mhm.
depart from me, for I never knew you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we can look at that at least the times we're entering upon now
Mhm.
and realize that the lines are a lot more clear. And we as Christians can go forth and boldly proclaim to those that wouldn't even proclaim to be Christians.
Mhm.
Right.
At least we know who we're dealing with.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's good, man. That's really good thoughts. And hopefully I pray that we will be those by God's grace that do stand faithful for him, stand firmly on truth and trusting in him, his sovereignty, and knowing that, like you said, P, in the end, we know that he has all victory, and that can be very reassuring.
And his means of victory was through death. And so even if death is the outcome, it's on par with redemption.
Right.
And how Christ,
Through his
That's good.
death,
through his death,
Yeah.
we have victory.
Yep.
Yes.
conquered
Yeah.
sin and death.
That's
and we
good.
too will conquer in the same
Amen.
That's
fashion.
good.
Yep.
Yeah. Man, that's been awesome. Thank you, Preston.
Yeah, thank you. That's
This
a
was
lot of
really
work
good.
in that,
This
brother.
is a lot of work, but it really helps provide a contextual background for understanding what the Christians at that time were facing.
Yeah.
And it really, I don't know about you guys, but provides me hope that God, the same God that lived then, was faithful,
Mhm.
and that's the same God that we serve now.
That's
Will
right.
continue to be
Yeah.
faithful.
Yeah.
It's good.
And even though we live in a new Rome, so to speak, so too should we be faithful like the Christians in the past who
Amen.
went off to the lions.
Yep.
Because then they went to the true lion,
Yeah.
right? Afterward. So
Yep.
it's just wild to me how many applications there are
Yeah.
to our own day and age.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, each one of us, we are so tempted to compromise when it comes to virtually every aspect of society.
Oh, yeah. It's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
Hmm.
We are called to bow to the new religion. Will we?
It's good.
It's good.
Mm.
Well, listen, hopefully this has been a huge encouragement for all of our listeners, as it has been for me
Mhm.
personally. And I know that there is great value in looking back towards God's faithfulness and God's faithful work in the lives of saints who have walked before us,
Yeah.
and God's faithfulness today in his saints that are living now, and God's continued faithfulness in the future, as even we view our children.
Mhm.
This gives us reason not for despair, but for hope, knowing that God will continue to do his glorious work, and it will be for his glory. And so
Yep.
hopefully you've been built up and encouraged in this, and we do hope that you will join us for our next episode, where we'll be closing out, Pastor will be closing out our series in church history.
Mhm.
Until then, God bless.
And good night.
Good night. Send us a message at feedback@shadowcastradio.com.
Follow us on Facebook and Instagram.
Check us out at shadowcastradio.com.